All right, guys, I've already mentioned how we are using lists in Python as arrays, and that the book talks about arrays. The book doesn't talk about lists. The difference being that lists can grow and shrink, whereas arrays are fixed. So now for a little while we're going to play with lists as lists rather than lists as arrays. So we're going to be doing some stuff that the book didn't show. But that's okay because we want to become awesome Python programmers as well as just good book learners. So what I'm going to show you is creating an empty list. The idea of an empty array is ridiculous, right? Because it's supposed to be a series of data. And if you pre-declare it to a certain length, you declare it to a length of 0, well, you can't have any data in it. But lists, it's a perfectly valid thing because then you can go and start appending data to it. Kind of like this. We're on lecture U, it looks like. So right now, we're going to be talking about lists as lists, not as arrays. Arrays are fixed in length. Once declared, it's a real problem to try to increase them. They cannot be appended to or deleted from. That doesn't mean that you can't change the data. You can change the data all you want. It's just kind of like an apartment building though, right? You want to add a new apartment to an existing apartment building, it's kind of a drag, right? If you want to delete an apartment from the middle of an apartment building, that's also kind of a drag. You could board it up, that's changing the value. You just can't physically delete the room, right? Or you just can't copy and paste a room and add it to the end of the apartment complex. So once declared, they cannot be changed in size, appended to, or deleted from, and then without considerable trouble. If you had to append to an array that was already full, you could declare a larger array, and then you could copy all the elements into it, and then you'd have room for a new one, new piece of data. Well, that's a lot of trouble to go through if you have an alternative data structure, which we do. We have lists. Just a reminder, Python supports lists exclusively, which we have been treating as arrays. Totally valid way of using lists, but they're more powerful than that. Like using an airplane as a truck. Sure, you could carry stuff around in the airplane, but then you could also do something better with the airplane. You could send it up into the sky. Well, my examples are always silly. All right, so we're going to declare an empty list so that we can start adding things to it. L, just for ease of sake, is equal to open subscript, close subscript. That's a list with no pieces of data in it. Well, we better get some data in it. We're going to use dot append, parentheses in parentheses, to stick some pieces of data in it. L dot append 23. I don't know why 23. Put whatever number you want in there. Let's do that a few more times. I might just copy and paste that line. So I can add like 10 pieces of data to it really fast. And 6 is enough, huh? For some reason, I'm kind of making them go from small to large. But we could also call a sort function, which would do that for us. All right, we have an array. Let's print it out. Let's print it out a couple of different ways. Now, on an exam, if I ask you to print an array, a list with a loop, don't do this. This is too easy because it's not a loop. Print L equals end quote comma L, right? That's not a loop. It just dumps the array to the screen. Which for quick and dirty is fine. Alrighty, but we can come up with better ways. Let's use a for loop to print it out. Two kinds of for loops. One is printing it by index, which I believe is what we've been doing already. Let me pull up Thursday's notes, make absolutely sure whether that's true. Yeah, just like this, right? This is printing it by index. We declare an index variable, and then we print out the array name subscript the index. Well, that works great, but there's other ways of doing it. So let's add a comment now. Print the array with a for index loop. So for I is a perfectly good index variable, in for I space in space range, and we need the length of the list, we need the length of the array, so we're going to just do len parentheses L in parentheses, and we better have one more closed parentheses to match the number of openings. And then we could print out, let's print out that index number even though the user may not want to see it, but let's really print out the value that we care about, which is L subscript I. And since it's going to start counting at 0, it's going to print out element 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Why do I say that? Because this is the first element, that 23 is 0, the 53 is a 1, 124 is the second, 454 is the third, 898 is index 4, 999 index is 5. All right, there we go. Printed it out nicely. Let's do another one-liner print statement. This is a little bit cooler. I'll have more respect for you if you do it this way than if you do it that way. I'm kidding. I won't disrespect you if you do that, but you wouldn't get full credit for it in a for loop. If I ask you to do a for loop and then you slip this into the exam instead, I'd probably give you credit just because it's cool. Print, parentheses, quote, and what do we want each piece of data separated by? A comma followed by a space? A question mark? Let's do the comma first. Comma followed by a space, end quote. Now this syntax looks a little bit silly, but parts of Python look a bit silly. What we're doing is we're saying we want everything joined with that piece of data. So after the end quote, print parentheses, comma, or quote, comma, end quote, dot, join. And what are we joining together with commas? Parentheses, L, in parentheses, in parentheses. Like I said, that looks a little bit strange, but if you can remember it, it's cool. Or you could get an error. Alrighty, forget that. Delete that for now. That only works with strings. Comment that out and say, oops, this only works if L is a list of strings. My mistake. All right, now we're going to print it with a for value index loop, which is like that, except it's a cleaner syntax actually, far cleaner. What do I mean by that? For v, short for value, in space L colon, print parentheses v. Now that's the way I would memorize to put on an exam. That's pretty dang cool. However, it doesn't work for parallel arrays. We were talking about parallel arrays on Wednesday. Why do I say that? Because we don't have an index number. And remember that parallel arrays are linked by their index number. Like if we had a list of students and then their favorite foods, we would need that index number to tie those arrays together. And we can't do that here. won't work because we don't have an index number. Not that we have parallel arrays in this example yet, but if we did, that won't work. But if we're just printing out one array rather than parallel arrays, that's perfect. Let's see what it looks like. It's all of our data. It doesn't have the index number, but that's because we don't have an index number. We have no idea of the index number here. So if you need the index number for some reason, this isn't appropriate. So I'm going to add a comment here as to what's going on here. Print the array list. I guess I'll just say array with a for value loop. Now the book's not going to talk about the difference between a for index loop and a for value loop. The only one they're going to show you is a for index loop. But sometimes we're more awesome than the book. Just because we're using a cool, powerful language and they can't show every cool feature of every cool language. Let's gussy that up so that it prints it all on one line. And we're going to use the E and D parameter to specify that we don't want it to go to the next line after every value it prints. That it can hang out on the same line, just like we were on a typewriter keyboard and hitting tab or something between our keys. And then finally just print out a blank line, you know, a character turn at the very end. Type, 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 and then hit the enter key. And that's what this is going to look like. For V space IN space L colon, print V comma E and D equals, well, firstly do it like this and then we're going to change it. Quote backslash n end quote. Backslash n, the backslash is the one above the enter key, not under the question mark. Now that's just going to do the same exact thing. But then we're going to modify it, right? That just printed out the numbers just like the other for loop. But if we change that to something else, it won't go to the next line each and every time. Like we could put a space there. And it would print out every number separated by a space. Now I like that. That's cool. Or put a tab there, a backslash T there. Print out all the values separated by tabs. That's also kind of cool. Of course, if it went off the edge of the screen, it wouldn't be so cool. Or E and D equals like that. Either way is cool. But we got to go to the next line after we're done. What do I mean by that? That printed everything on one line and went all the way out to the end, but it never went to the next line so that we could start printing something else. Like if I added this message, I may delete this real soon so you don't have to do it. Print done. If I add that and we run it, where are we going to see the done message? Way out here at the end. I don't want that. I want it to go to the next line. So I need to print the character turn right here. That's enough. That's enough to get it to the next line. Like that. All right, so what have we seen so far? We've seen using append. We've seen empty lists. Let's make this a multi-line comment. So far we've seen empty lists and appending to that and printing it out with a for index loop and with a for value loop. That's kind of really good stuff to know. What if you want to insert into it rather than append? Well, let's make a new list. I'm tired of those numbers. Let's put some names in a list. So S names, like student names. Now we're going to initialize this array with data. But then we're going to start appending into it, inserting into it. So we have Fred, we have Helen, And we have Mike, 3 names. Then we have some new students coming into class. We could append them to the end. We can insert them into the beginning. We could actually insert them anywhere. Say we have somebody named Alice. We're going to insert them into the beginning of the list. snames.insert into position 0, Alice. Now that's going to be the new first element in the list because I said make this element 0. And the rest of them are all going to be pushed out now. So if we printed out our student list, if we print snames, there, see? Alice became the new element 0, and so the rest of them got pushed over. What if we wanted to insert a name right here? We wanted to insert Jean with a G. Well, what element is this, counting them out? What's the index number of that element?
2.
That's a 2. So we're going to insert Jean at position 2. And then Jean will push Helen and Mike down. So snames.insert 2, comma, quote, Jean, end quote. Let's print it again. Make sure that worked. And there we go. And we could print that out with a for loop or a for each loop. Sorry, when I say for each, that's the same thing as a for value loop. It's just that some languages actually have the each keyword. By the way, for value is also known as a for each. Just if I say that, I want you to know that. So let's print snames with a for value loop. For v, but it doesn't have to be v. We can call that variable anything we want. We can call it Tony Stark if we wanted to. Let's maybe use the whole word. For value in snames, colon, print quote, student name equals, end quote, comma, value. Just to make it look a little bit fancier. And there we go. There's our 5 students. So quite often, we don't know in advance how many pieces of data there's going to be. Sometimes we do. But like we're going to ask for a series of temperatures, weekly temperatures or daily temperatures. Well, there's 7 days in a week. We might declare the array to be 7 items long and then start putting information in. But sometimes we don't know, right? We don't know how many test scores are going to be in this series of quizzes or whatever. So you can use an empty array and then start appending to it to let the user enter a series of scores. Like say on our guessing game, we wanted to record every guess they made so that at the end of the game we could print out all the things that they guessed. Or they're playing hangman and we want to keep a track of all the letters that they have guessed. So we would need some way to keep track of that. There's no better way than to put it in a list and create an empty list and start adding stuff to it, which we did up here, but it could be in a loop, right? Anytime you see a series of things like that, that looks like something that you could do in a loop. So now we're going to let the user enter a series of scores with -1 as the sentinel. -1 stops the input. So what's the syntax for declaring an empty list? Scores equals, and what am I going to put here? It's okay if you don't remember. We've only done it once at the top of this lecture, but maybe someone doesn't remember. How did we make the empty list? We did L equals.
Empty bracket, right?
Right. Empty subscripts.
You know, what's that called?
Square braces.
Square
braces, and I'm calling them subscript because everywhere else I say, type in L subscript I. So yeah, that's an empty list. Or if you're feeling it and you don't want to use that, you could type that instead. List parentheses.
That's the same thing?
That's the exact same thing. I'm going to go ahead and do it like that. So let's get some data. When are we going to store this variable in here? Now my urge, and I'm not going to do this, so don't type this, would be to say score equals 0, while score is not equal to -1, blah, blah, blah. But whenever I start mixing plurals and singular things that differ only by an S or whatever, it makes it more difficult to type. So while it seems logical, don't know if I would do that. So let's just call it X. X is a boring name. I'd get fired for using single letter variable names, but why not? We need a variable just to hold the scores that we are going to be entering. And we're going to do while X not equal, in other words, exclamation mark equals, -1, colon, because that's the sentinel. It's asked for the score. Ooh, we can get all fancy and do some defensive programming. Yeah, that's not. Although it'd be worth revisiting that before the end of the semester. Let's get our input. X equals input, parentheses, quote, enter score, parentheses, or -1 to stop, in parentheses. And then maybe a couple spaces and a greater than sign to let them know where they're supposed to type. And after the greater than sign, colon, we need after the greater than quote, we need a closing parentheses. We could make sure that it's a number. And if it's not a number, we could complain. But I'm not going to do that. If X equals -1, they want to stop, so we're just going to print, okay, we're done, something to that effect. Print parentheses, quote, okay, done, end quote, end parentheses. And then back tab, because we're going to have an else colon that actually appends it. Else colon, we need to append it to our list. Scores.append. All right, I've made an error. Anybody see a step that I left out? I mean, this isn't totally wrong, but this statement would crash right here. And why would that be? After we do X is equal to input, what kind of data is it? What's its type as of here? It's a string, and what do we always need to do to convert it to a number?
We got a floating, right?
Yeah, let's make it a float. So X equals float, parentheses X, in parentheses. Now that's the part that could crash. We might try to fix that, but we're not going to right now. Keep this example as clean as possible. We could put a message here, parentheses, score added to list, in parentheses, right? And now I'm going to back tab twice and just put end while. And then just to see our scores, why don't we just print the list? Whoa. Okay. Print parentheses, quote, scores equals, end quote, comma, scores all lowercase, just because that's what I called the variable. maybe I ought to make this lowercase too to make it match exactly. Not necessary. Now we're getting to the point where the program's going to be annoying to debug because every single time we run it, we're going to have to be entering data. So you never know. We might comment this out or something. All right, I'm going to test it. All right, enter score. 100. Score added to list. 90. 95. 98. -1. Okay, done, because they typed in the Sentinel value. And we do have 4 scores in there now. At that point, we could calculate the average, we could calculate the sum. There's a really easy way of getting the sum. Usually I make people, declare an accumulator and have a loop that adds it all up. But honestly, since Python gives us a way, why don't we do it this way? Total equals sum, parentheses, scores, in parentheses. And then how do you calculate the average? It's equal to the total divided by the number of items, right?
Yes.
If you earned 100 and a 90 and an 80 and a 70, you'd add all those up together and divide by 4. So average, maybe just AVG, equals the total divided by LEN parentheses scores, the number of scores. LEN returns the length of the list of the array. Now we've got an itty-bitty problem here, which is that if they didn't enter any data, if they type in a -1 as their first piece of data, then what is the length of the array going to be? 0. And when you divide by 0, it's going to crash. So I don't know if we're going to fix that or not, but just keep it in mind that if you're adding to an empty list, that can be a problem. So enter your score. Alrighty, 100, 90, 80, 70, -1. Okay, done. Scores equals 100, 90, 80, and 70. Bless you. What if they wanted to type all those scores in on one line? We could write some code that would handle that. It uses
Instead of being prompted each time.
Right. Just enter all scores separated by spaces and hit enter for a fast way of entering your data. Now, I'm not sure that I would really like that. I think I would. That takes advantage of a feature of Python called split. Let's demonstrate split first before we make anything more complicated. Split works like this. It just takes a string like that, and then let's split it up. S equals S dot split. And what is this data split by? It's split by spaces. So inside the parentheses, we need to do quote, space, end quote, in parentheses. If it was separated by commas, we would put a comma there instead. And now let's print S out. And what we're going to see is, right, those 6 values stored in a list. All right, enter test score. Just as I promised, if we typed in a -1 here, then our array length is going to be 0, and it's going to crash when we try to calculate the average. So let's don't do that. And here's our string that was separated by spaces, turned into a list. Now it's kind of subtle, but if we wanted to use that to calculate a total, we would not be able to call sum. Can anybody hazard a guess why, looking very carefully at the values between these square braces, what would happen if we just tried to add all those together? What type is each element?
String.
It's a string, and you can't add strings. If we somehow manage to, we just wind up with one great big long string, 100, 20, 30, 40, 10, and 20 all concatenated together. So we would need to turn all of that data into numbers before we could do anything with it. And it's kind of a drag that dot split won't do that for you. But on the other hand, dot split doesn't know what kind of data you're typing in. You might be typing in names. You might be typing in colors. You might be typing in turtle commands. I don't know what. So it can't predict whether those things are going to be numbers or not. So we would have to convert those things to numbers. There's a really easy way, but unfortunately it uses an advanced feature of Python called list comprehension. So it's okay with me if you just type this and then forget it. I'm not going to ask it in a quiz. And then when you take scripting, bring it back in your brain because you're going to see it again. This is known as list comprehension. And what is list comprehension? List comprehension is when you create a list like this. I'm going to reuse our scores array or something like that. Or I could just use S. S equals, and then you put square braces, and instead of just putting numbers in there, you put a formula. Our formula, we want to convert all of these to floats. So inside the square braces, we're going to put float E, could be X, could be anything, could be Fred, for E in S. What does this mean? For every value in S, turn it into a float, and then stick it back into the list S. So we're going to erase list S and replace it with a list of floats based on what S was originally. We could change that E to a V like we were doing earlier because it's a value-based for loop, right? For value in S. We could even type out the whole word for value, right? Variable names are meaningless except to humans. The computer doesn't care what the variable names are as long as they're used consistently. And that would do it. If we print S out now, it's now a list of numbers. So we better add a comment here as to what the heck this is doing. The above line uses list comprehension, which is putting a formula between the square braces to build a new list. It's a great way of converting from one kind of list to another. Excuse me, from one kind of type to another. If we didn't have that feature, it would take several lines to get it to work. We may as well go ahead and demonstrate that. It's not too bad. It's only 2 lines of code long. So we may as well do that. We would use an index-based loop because we need the index in order to get this to work. So let's do the below shows the same way, or shows the same thing with a normal for loop, for index loop. So for I in range, parentheses len, parentheses s, in parentheses colon, s subscript I equals float s subscript I. Now this probably looks better, excuse me, more understandable to you than this. On the other hand, maybe this perfectly clicks, right? No big deal either way. I want you to understand this way. This is the way that you actually kind of need to understand, just because it uses for loops and list manipulation using that, using indexing, just like if we were printing S subscript I out. So you kind of need to get that. It's just that this is a fairly powerful technique for manipulating lists that can be done in a single line of syntax. And maybe you can see how similar they are. We don't have anything called value, right? Because this is not an index-based for loop. It's a value-based for loop. But we're still taking each element and turning it into a float, just like we're doing here. I'm going to run mine to see if I get a syntax error, and then I'll come and help y'all. Enter score, or -1 to stop. Alrighty, got to enter at least 1 or else it'll crash. We ought to fix that. We ought to scroll back up and fix that. We could put an if length of list is equal to 0, then print empty list, cannot calculate average. Or we could just say that the average is 0, right? But that's not strictly true. If you don't have any pieces of data, you can't really say average is equal to 0. It's non-data. Anyways, here we go. It was strings, now it's floats. We could do some math on it. We could calculate the sum or whatever. So just whatever. Total equals sum, parentheses S. So that was a lot of trouble to go through to turn that into something that we could turn it into a float. But not really. It's not that much trouble. It just looks like a lot of trouble because we added a lot of comments. So let's repeat that process just with 3 lines. L is equal to, or S is equal to parentheses, not parentheses, S is equal to quote, and then type some numbers in. Doesn't matter what numbers. All separated by spaces. If you feel like throwing in decimal points, that's fine. Just make sure that they're surrounded by quotes. Now let's split that. S equals S dot split. Now, if you leave off the thing between the parentheses, it honestly assumes spaces anyways. Just kind of like if you leave off the 0 in a range statement, it assumes you're counting from 0. Or S dot split, parentheses, quote, space end quote. Does the same thing. The only time you have to put something inside the parentheses is if you're splitting based on something other than quotes. Right? If you're splitting based on commas, you better put the comma between the parentheses here. We could demonstrate that. We could put commas between all these numbers if we so chose. All right, and then let's turn it, each item in the list, into a float. Now, do we want to do it this way, or do we want to do it this way? First way or second way? First person to pick a way wins. List comprehension or a for loop?
Well, I'm sorry, I was trying to.
I'll pick a way.
What was the question?
The question is, now that we have a list of strings, which way do we want to convert it to a list of numbers? List comprehension or for loop?
This is a for loop.
Yeah, let's use a for loop. More traditional. Okay, so for I in range, parentheses, len, parentheses s, in parentheses, colon. S subscript I equals float S subscript I, in subscript in parentheses. And now we have a list that we could calculate the total of. So total equals sum, parentheses, S parentheses. So it took 5 lines of code, but once you can read it, and you don't need all those comments there to explain it, right? That's not too bad. We could be reading our numbers from a file and adding them to a list. I'd kind of like to do that. We haven't done enough file I/O. So we're going to need a data file full of numbers to add together. Why don't I just make it with idle? I'm going to do a save as. Make sure you save this into the same directory. And maybe I'll just call it lectureu.data.py. Or .txt would be good too. But we're going to have to type this file name in over and over. We could just hard code it in. That way we won't have to type it in over and over. It's always a good idea to ask for the file name, but you know, I was thinking about just calling it data.py to make it easier to do. Let's do that. Data.py.
It's a new file?
Yes, this is going to be a new file. And I'd actually kind of rather make it a text file. So I'm going to use the pull down here to make it a text file. If you didn't make it a text file, just remember that it's a py file. Why am I saying make it a text file? So that I could open it up with Notepad. All right, let's type in some numbers. Now we could ask them to use a Sentinel value. We could say enter a -1 at the end of our numbers. But really the end of file is a good Sentinel value, right? Just make sure that you hit enter once at the end of your data, right? When you type in 1, 2, 3, don't just leave it there. You've got to be able to go to the next line, or else it won't count it. I don't know if that's strictly true. Anyways, do it that way. And then save your data. If you don't save it, it's not there, so make sure you save your data.
And it really doesn't matter what numbers we use. does it?
Right, right, right. Don't copy my numbers exactly. All right. I guess I didn't need to close that. I should have just minimized it. I'm going to open it back up under Recent Files. Bang it over here on the side. All right. I haven't checked. Anybody have syntax errors that you'd like me to look at? All right. All right, it's been a little bit since we've done file access. Good time for a reminder. So let's do file equals open parentheses, and we need our file name, which I think I called mine data.txt. Maybe you saved yours as data.py. Maybe you called it lectureu, right? We talked about several options. Just make sure that this file name exactly matches the name of the file you just created over here. And make sure that it's in the same directory. You know what I'd rather do though? Let's do a slightly better job of this programming and not just put this as a string literal there. Instead, do fname, short for file name, equals, quote, data.txt, end quote. And then between the parentheses, let's not make it data.txt, let's just make it fname. That way we could print out nice error messages and print out the file name. Or we could have asked the user for the file name. I just don't feel like making us type that file name in every time. All right. Now we could process every line of data in the file. But we have to do a couple of things, at least one. We need to declare our empty list so that we can start appending to it. So data equals, and remember again, variable names are meaningless to anybody except us, as long as we use them consistently. I could have called it just D, but I'm trying to make this a good example. So the data that we're reading from the file, this is going to be the empty list to fill with numbers from the file. So for line in file, colon, and just from experience, I know that there's some things that we should do to the data, which would be to clean the data up of spaces before it and after it, because if we accidentally added a space after the number or something like that, it might be a problem. So we're going to use the strip option, which removes spaces and line feeds and stuff like that from beginning and end. So line equals line dot strip, parentheses in parentheses. And I'm going to add a comment as to what that's doing. Remove white space from start and end of the line. And we could add a comment to this one. For line in file, what is that doing? For each line in the file. I mean, it's kind of self-explanatory, but I don't mind adding too many comments. Now back tab this one to make sure. I mean, if you put all your comments on one line, like you probably should, the only reason, you know why I'm doing that, because my font's larger than yours. Now we can convert it to a float. Value equals float parentheses line. Now what we have always done in the past is just convert, right, like that. Line equals float line. But we could store the result of the float command in another variable. And then we're going to append that to our list. So data.append parentheses value. Now there'd be some niceties that we could add to this. Like I think this is going to crash if we have a blank line at the end of our code, of our file. We might want to fix that. It's not too hard to do that. 100 -1. It didn't print anything out, did it? Oh well, we'll fix that. After our for loop, why don't we close the file? You should always close your file when you're done reading from it. File.close, parentheses in parentheses. All right, I'll show you what I mean. If I put a blank line at the beginning, at the end of my data, or anywhere else, honestly, like if I just hit character turn there and I don't notice, and then I save it with a Control S, or file save, and then I run it again, it's going to blow up. What does it say? Cannot convert string to float. Why? Because there's no data there. So what we need to do is after we strip it, we need to make sure that there actually is some data in it, that its length is greater than 0. So here before our value is equal to float line, we're going to put an if statement there, and we're going to tab in these next two things. We're going to indent those two lines. So above value is equal to float line, let's just do an if statement. Make sure it's tabbed over once. If len parentheses line in parentheses colon, or no, remove the colon. If len parentheses line in parentheses greater than 0 colon, value equals float line needs to be tabbed, data.append needs to be tabbed.
What's LAN stand for?
Length. Like the length of the string, how many characters are in the string, or how many items are in the list. Else it was a blank line. But if that's the case, we're not going to do anything. After our file.close, I always like to put, at least for educational purposes, that we are done reading from the file, just so that we have some message on the screen, right? Because at this point, when we run it, we don't get any output at all. And yeah, we're going to modify that. But right, it just shows a blinking cursor at the end, right there, you know. We have no indication. So either before the file close or after it, I'm going to do print completely back tab. Print parentheses quote, done reading from end quote, comma, fname. All right. As promised, it's getting annoying typing these numbers in each time, but there we go. Done reading from text file. Why don't we print our scores out? Just so that we got to see what was in the file. And let's be awesome about it and actually use a loop. So for, do we want to use a value-based loop because the syntax is easier, or do we want to use an index-based loop because that's more old school textbook style? Let's use the index-based loop. For I in space len parentheses, but excuse me, I forgot the range statement. For I space in space range parentheses len parentheses data close parentheses colon print parentheses I comma data subscript I. And we could add them up with a sum, you know. We may as well do that without using the sum function because the book is going to show it to you this way. But we're going to take advantage of the for value-based loop just because it's so nice. So total equals 0. Next line. Oh, by the way, this is all unindented now. For value in data colon total plus equals value. Now all of that could have just been replaced. The above is the same as total equals sum parentheses data. Now if I ask a test question, I guarantee that at least one person is going to mess the two syntaxes up. What do I mean by that? Absolutely do not type this because this is wrong. Somebody's going to do this. For value in data colon total plus equals value subscript I. Now what's wrong with that? Well, the first time through the loop, what is I going to equal? It's almost a trick question. There is no I, right? There's no I defined in our loop, so we can't use it as an index value. If you want an I in your loop, you better do it like that. This is mixing up the syntax of a value-based loop and an index-based loop. So somebody will do that. Like I said, do not type that because it's wrong. Or somebody's going to do this. For I in data colon total plus equals I. No, that's not wrong. That's not wrong. Let me retype it and get it wrong. For I in range parentheses len parentheses data close. Don't type this because it's wrong. Print or total plus equals I. Now, what's wrong with that? What is I equal to the first time we go through the list, through the for loop?
It's not set to anything, is it?
Well, it starts off at 0, right? So we're going to add 0 to total. And then it's going to increment it. And total, and I is going to equal 1, and we're going to add 1 to total, and then we're going to add 2 to total, and we're going to add 3 to total. Now what's wrong with that? We weren't trying to add up 1 plus 2 plus 3. We were trying to add the elements of data. How would I fix that so we were accessing the elements of data rather than just 1, 2, and 3? How did we do it up here? How did we write our index-based for loop up here?
I'm trying to follow.
Well, what if I just did this? What if I just did print I? What's it going to print? Is it going to print out the list? Is it going to print out the data? Let's run it and find out. Experimentation. All right, why did it print out the numbers 0 through 7? I wanted it to print out the data, but instead I just got 0 through 7.
Is this the index number?
Yeah, we got to put the list name there. We don't just want to print out the index, we want to print out the list itself, right? So data subscript I. That would fix it. I hope that's real clear, right? If you're just printing out I, you're just printing out 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's not right. Okay, another mistake. For value in data, colon, print, parentheses, data. Somebody predict what that's going to do. Well, we've seen what happens if you print the list. It prints it out with a square brace and a whole bunch of numbers separated by commas, right? Do we really want to just do that inside our for loop? Watch what happens. Yeah, that's probably not what I wanted. What if the file is 10,000 items long? Would I want to print 10,000 repeated identical lines?
No.
No, we wouldn't. So, how do I fix that? We don't want to print the data. The data is the entire list. Instead, we want to print one element of it. What do I need to fix? What do I need to replace data with?
Like
Here's what I can't do.
data, will it be similar to what it?
Right, I can't do that because we don't have an I. So what do we got to do? And you were asking a question to clarify it, and I think that you were about to go in the right direction.
Yeah. When we say value in data, we're looking for something specific within the data that we have.
It's every element that's in data. The first element of the first time it runs, value contains like this, like this. This is real important, so I'm going to actually force us to get this right. Feel free to type this if you want. Colors equals square brace, quote, red, end quote, comma, green, end quote, comma, blue, end quote. Now I'm going to do the mistake that I mentioned. For value in colors, colon, print, parentheses, colors. That's a mistake because it's just going to print those three. Let's run it and see what it prints. Ooh, and it's time to stop. I have to stop this little point of the lecture. All right, so it printed out red, green, and blue. It printed out the entire list 3 times in a row. We don't want that. We want to fix this so that it's only printing out one color. And so you put the that variable there. For every value in colors, print every, no, don't do that, I'm going to undo that. That's what that means. Or for each value in colors. All right, so the homework's going to be real easy, mostly because I ran out of time. All right. Write code that will A, declare an empty list called numbers. B, use dot append to add at least 4 numbers to the list. C, use dot insert to insert 2 more numbers into the beginning of the list. D, print the list using a 4 index loop. E, print the list using a 4 value loop. And since it's a list of numbers, we may as well calculate the average. F, calculate the average as sum parentheses numbers divided by ln numbers. And print it. So calculate and print the average. All right. We're going to cover some of this stuff again on Wednesday, and then we will review, since we talked about having an exam, I believe, on Tuesday. That would allow you to skip the final.
When you say Tuesday, you mean tomorrow?
Yeah, sorry about that. Not Tuesday. Tomorrow, Wednesday.
Okay, I was like,
Yeah. Yeah, you got to come back in on Tuesday, even though we never meet on Tuesday. No, class on Wednesday. We're going to do some more on lists, and we're going to do a review.